What's going on, everybody? Top 10 Pokemon back with another Pokemon card auctions of the week recap. Folks, week after week, this market seems to be getting stronger and stronger. In today's recap, we'll be going over a couple of cards from the newest sets, Black Bolt and White Flare, several high-end, both vintage and modern Pokemon cards, including another PSA 10 First Edition base set Charizard that came through. There's a lot to go over, as always, so please stay tuned till the very end. Folks, after you're done enjoying this week's recap, please head over to the 100% Pokemon card auction block happening this Sunday, July 27th on fanaticscollect.com. There you will see numerous graded Pokemon cards being auctioned off that span the entire TCG. I'm talking beautiful WotC Hollows, EX era cards, all the way through the chase cards from the Black and White era as well. Here is a preview of just some of the grails up for grabs this week. Once again, no shortage of variety here, folks. And don't forget to take advantage of the sales tax-free vault when you buy on Fanatics. A direct link to this auction block will be in the description of this video. Go check it out, folks, and thank you so much for your support. Alright, folks, let's start off this recap with some cards from the newest White Flare Black Bolt sets. Here we have this monochrome Victini card. I got two sales for you, one for $730, the other one for $860. And these are both the number 172 copies of this card. When we contrast to the Noble Victories Full Art Victini in PSA 10 that also came by this week, that sold for $2,450. Here we have the Zekrom EX from Black Bolt that sold for $430, while the Full Art Zekrom from the old school black and white set sold as a PSA 10 this week for $2,900. And then we can't forget this full art Reshiram EX from White Flare that sold for $440 raw. Up next, we have the Stained Glass Birds, Moltres, Zapdos, and Articuno GX from the Hidden Fates Elite Trainer box, selling this week as a PSA 10 for $340, while the Japanese copy of this card sold for $1,225. And then here, once again, we have this Mewtwo GX from Shining Legends that sold as a PSA 10 for $3,800. And of course, the Shining Legends Elite Trainer box is also no slouch, selling this week for $620. And then, as you already probably know, the Poncho Pikachus and the Mario Pikachu cards are just through the roof. Here are a couple of BGS 10 pristine Rayquaza poncho-wearing Pikachus that both sold for $15,600. And then here are both of the Mega Charizard poncho-wearing Pikachus, also BGS 10s, that sold for $20,600 this week. And then we saw sequential cert-numbered PSA 10s, both Mario Pikachu and Luigi Pikachu cards. All four of these cards sold for $20,211. Up next, we have that Chinese exclusive Mew EX that came by as a PSA 10 and sold for $14,610, while a BGS 10 pristine copy of this card sold for $26,500. And then a couple of awesome black label Japanese cards came by. Here is a Mega Tokyo's Pikachu, got the black label and sold for $5,300. Here's a Japanese Gengar VMAX that sold for $6,050. Here is a black label Japanese Latios GX, sold for $11,100. And then here's a Japanese Gold Star Groudon that sold for $16,100. And then we saw several amazing sales from the XY era. From Breakthrough, we have this Full Art Houndoom EX, sold as a PSA 10 for $761. This Full Art Darkrai from Breakpoint sold for $930. Also from Breakpoint was this Mega Scizor EX that sold for $960. Here's a Mega Gyarados EX that sold for $1,580, while the Full Art Secret Rare Gyarados EX sold as a PSA 10 for $2,025. And then from Fates Collide, we saw this Secret Rare Alakazam come by, and it sold for $1,950. A couple of Charizards from the XY era also came by. Here is a Mega Charizard EX from Flashfire, sold for $2,900. Here's another Mega Charizard EX. This is the ultra rare copy that sold for $5,100. And then we saw this Mega Charizard EX from XY Generations, sold for $2,750. Up next, folks, from Phantom Forces, we have this regular old Gengar EX in PSA 10 sell for $535, while the ultra rare Mega Gengar EX sold as a PSA 10 for a whopping $8,635. Getting into some vintage cards cards, we have this Shadowless PSA 10 Venusaur that sold for $3,816. And for some reason, I feel like this is an undervalued card. When I see one of the big three as a PSA 10 Shadowless copy, I feel like it should go for more than this. I don't know. What do you think? Here we have the CGC 10 Pristine First Edition Pidgeot from Jungle, sold for $2,950. Here we have that First Edition Gengar from Fossil, sold this week for $7,100 as a PSA 10, while the First Edition Fossil Booster Box sold for $15,501. And you don't really see a lot of high-end booster boxes come by on eBay anymore. They usually sell on platforms like Golden and Heritage, but hey, whatever. Getting into some Neo Series cards, we have this First Edition Jumpluff from Neo Genesis. It sold as a PSA 10 for $685, and this is a very low pop card. Only 35 PSA 10 copies, so with a population like that, I thought this card would have went for a lot more, but it's also a pretty unpopular Pokemon, so there you go. From Neo Discovery, we saw this First Edition Houndoom sell as a PSA 10 for even $2,000. Here is an Unlimited Suicune from Neo Revelation, sold as a PSA 10 for $6,085 this week, while this PSA 10 First Edition Shining Magikarp, also from Neo Revelation, sold for $6,651. Here is a Light Dragonite First Edition Holo from Neo Destiny, sold for $4,057. And then we saw several Crystal cards come by. Here is a Crystal Celebi from Skyridge, sold for $6,800. The Crystal Kingdra sold for $2,801. The Crystal Nidoking from Aquapolis sold for $6,717. And then we saw the Crystal Lugia as a PSA 9 sell for an even $8K this week. A couple of Moltres sales that were very intriguing. Here's the First Edition Fossil Moltres in PSA 10 that sold for $2,025. The First Edition Rockets Moltres from Gym Hero sold as a PSA 10 for $1,601 this week. And then here is this Black Star Promo Moltres EX that sold for $2,291. A couple of Umbreons also came by. Here's a First Edition Umbreon from Neo Discovery. The Umbreon rookie card sold for $13,800 as a PSA 10. Here's the Umbreon from Skyridge that sold as a PSA 10 for $13,650. Here is an Umbreon Holo from EX Delta Species that sold for $3,100, while the reverse holo copy sold for $5,300. A couple of awesome Mewtwo card sales. Here is the best Mewtwo in the entire TCG, the Mewtwo Holo from Expedition, sold as a PSA 10 for $5,500. Here's the Rockets Mewtwo EX that kind of cooled off this week. This card was going for like over $8,000. We saw two sales of it this week, one for $6,600, the other one for $7,435. And then a couple of awesome Gyarados cards. Here is Giovanni's Gyarados in PSA 10, sold for $1,850. Here is a Gyarados Reverse Holo from Deoxys that sold for $4,650. And then we saw this Gyarados from Heart Gold Soul Silver that sold for $6,700. And then two awesome Rayquaza sales. Here is the Reverse Holo Rayquaza from EX Delta Species that sold for $6,100, while this Full Art Rayquaza from Ancient Origins sold for $7,300. Here is a Palkia Holo from Great Encounters. This is a Cosmos Holo, sold as a PSA 10 for $2,605. I always like seeing regular holo cards fetch prices like this. Is pretty cool. And then we have this Lugia from Call of Legends that sold as a PSA 10 for $8,900. And then two more cards on eBay. They were both Charizards. Here is the Topps Chrome Techno Charizard in PSA 10, sold for $20,299, while this Reverse Holo Charizard from Legendary Collection landed a PSA 10 and sold for $31,750. A couple of sales from Fanatics Collect, both weekly and monthly auction blocks. Here is a Blaziken Level X. Oh, the more and more I see them, the more and more I love Level X cards. This card in PSA 10 sold this week for $8,100. Here we have two screen promos. Here is the Mimikyu that sold this week for $9,600. And we saw the Pikachu, which is kind of catching up to it in price, that sold this week for $8,100. Here is a Charizard EX from Fire Red Leaf Green, sold for $8,400. Here we have a BGS 9 No Rarity Japanese base set Charizard, and this card sold for $23,400. And This kind of always happens on Fnatic. I'm not sure if it affected the price at all, but they never put in the title this is a no rarity symbol Charizard. I think that's pretty important when you're selling a high-end card like this, but like I said, maybe it didn't affect the price at all. All I know is if I was a seller of this card, I'd be kind of perturbed that they didn't put that in the title. I don't know. And then here we have a 1997 Japanese Top Sun Blueback no number Charizard that got a CGC10 Gem Mint, sold for $5,880. And it's interesting because last year at this time, this card sold with the exact same grade for $16,800. Back then it was a population of 3. Now it doubled, so it's a Pop 6 card, but the price really came down for it. And we're going to finish off this auction block with a couple of Charizards and a trophy card. Here is a BGS 9.5 Crystal Charizard from Skyridge, sold for $13,500. Here is a PSA 10 Japanese Gold Star Charizard that sold for $25,800. Here is another Topps Chrome Techno Charizard. This one is a CGC 10 Pristine copy, sold for $37,200. And then we saw a bunch of first edition base set Charizards. Here's a BGS 9 copy, sold for $22,200. Here's a BGS 9.5 copy that sold for $54,000. A PSA 9 copy that sold for $36,000. And then we saw a PSA 10 copy sell for $264,000 this week. And then the final auction on this week's recap is this Trophy Kangaskhan, sold as a BGS 9 for $57,600. Boy, oh boy, folks, the money just keeps flowing through this market. What'd you think of this auction recap? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching. I'll catch you all on my next one.